You're listening to episode 334 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Matteo Pistono returns to the podcast to speak about his new book, Roar, Sulak, Sivaraksa, and the Path of Socially Engaged Buddhism. Hi everyone. Just a reminder that this podcast and all the other offerings by the Secular Buddhist Association can't continue without your support. Visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button if you find value in what the SBA has made freely available for over 10 years now. Thank you for your generosity and your care. Buddhism is ostensibly about ending suffering by extinguishing attachment, and that may seem in conflict with the complexities of social justice, inextricably part of samsara, or conditioned existence. That doesn't look closely enough, though. Buddhism also has much to contribute to how each of us lives this very life. Matteo Pistono is a writer and meditation teacher. His photos and writings about meditation, Buddhism, yoga, in the Himalayan and Southeast Asian cultural, political, and spiritual landscapes have appeared in the Washington Post, Global Post, Buddha Dharma, Tricycle, and elsewhere. Matteo completed his undergraduate degree in anthropology from the University of Wyoming, and in 1997 he obtained his Master of Arts degree in Indian philosophy from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. After working with the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. on Tibetan cultural programs, he lived and traveled throughout the Himalayas for a decade, bringing to the West graphic accounts and photos of China's human rights abuses in Tibet, which was documented in The Shadow of the Buddha. Matteo sits on the Executive Council of the International Network of Engaged Buddhists. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice ginger mint tea.
Okay.
Our guest today, returning to the podcast from a little time away, is Matteo Pistono. Matteo, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you here.
Yeah, it's great to be back, Ted. Yeah, it's been a few years.
Yes. And our perfect timing. We love our dogs, and I was just talking with Matteo about, dogs occasionally bark. That's okay. We leave that kind of stuff in. That's
quite all right. Yeah, dogs teach us a lot, actually. That dog's taught me a lot about patience.
Yeah, I was just telling some of my students, one of my best teachers ever is my dear dog Pogo. He is so very present. He takes me for walks. I always appreciate it.
So anyways, it's nice. Yeah, nice to be back.
Yeah, it's great. The last time you and I spoke was, drum roll please, in 2011, 9 years ago. It was one of the episode 52, and I'll have a link for those who are interested in catching up on that. I'll link that on this episode page. And that was about your book, In the Shadow of the Buddha, and you have a new book that's come out, and I really want to catch up. I want to hear from you because it's been a long time since you've been here. What have you been up to since?
Yeah. Well, In the Shadow of the Buddha came out in 2011, and that was, it was a memoir actually of this sort of decade where I was living and working in. I was living in Kathmandu, but working in Tibet and in China. And the book is essentially about me smuggling information out of China. But it was woven into that narrative was a kind of a pilgrimage that I was on. And I was on a sort of a pilgrimage in the footsteps of this 19th century mystic by the name of Lerab Lingpa, Terten Lerab Lingpa. and also known as Terten Sogyal. And so I was collecting a lot of information during that time on his life, and some of that is in the Shadow of the Buddha. So I got finished writing that book, and I was busy with that book for a year afterwards. I traveled around the country a couple times. I ended up doing about 60 events across America, and then it was released in England. I went there to India. It was released there, and so it was. I had never published a book before, so it was an amazing time. And then after that finished, I was contacted by the people who picked up the publication of In the Shadow of the Buddha for the UK and the rest of the world, because the um, the way that publishing works, it's sort of published in different parts of the world. You pick up you sort of sell it to different publishers. My UK publisher of In the Shadow of the Buddha came back to me and said, "Hey, you mentioned to us that you were doing all of this research on this mystic Terten Sogyal. Do you want to write a book about him?" And so I was like, and I'd already done actually I'd done almost all of the research. I'd been researching him essentially for about a decade.
Mm-hmm.
And this Terten Sogyal he died in 1927, and he was a teacher to the previous Dalai Lama. This is the 14th Dalai Lama. He was a teacher to the 13th Dalai Lama. And he was he was sort of a swashbuckling, sort of dreadlocked mystic from Eastern Tibet, sort of rough around the edges. But he was a very accomplished tantric master. And so his rituals were believed to be able to actually control outer phenomena. So the Tibetan government brought him to Lhasa to essentially use him as their sort of foreign policy, to execute their foreign policy. So when the Young Husband expedition came in 1904, they hired him. They had him do the rituals to repel. They had him do the rituals to repel the Chinese that were coming from the East later. And so in any case, I wrote that book, and it was called Fearless in Tibet. And that was really, I love that book. I'd been, working on it for actually over a decade. The writing took quite a while. And it was a sort of a labor of love, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And then that publisher, it was Hay House in the UK. And then after I finished doing Fearless in Tibet, I was teaching meditation, I was living in Washington, D.C. with my wife. And then Hay House came back to me again and said, "Hey, do you want to write a book on meditation? Because you're teaching so much. Do you want to write a book on a sort of meditation 101? Mm-hmm. And of course, I said, aren't there enough books out there right now on meditation? But in any case, they were keen, and it was fun. It was much different, writing a sort of how-to book. And there was a video course associated with it, and it was unlike anything I'd done before. Mm-hmm. And that was called, I think, Meditations, the Basics, with Hay House. And then I was continuing to teach, and I was, all of this time, even before that, I had been involved with an organization that was based in Thailand, but it was a worldwide organization called the International Network of Engaged Buddhists. Mm-hmm. The founder of that is now he must be 88 years old, is a man by the name of Sulak Sivaraksa. Okay, Sulak Sivaraksa. The last name is Sanskritized name, Sivaraksa. But Sulak, or they call him Ajahn Sulak, like teacher Sulak. But Ajahn Sulak, he's the founder of it. And I think that we'll talk a little bit about him, because I met him. I was working with the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, doing socially engaged Buddhism, both in the United States and in India and in Thailand. I was involved with various projects. And then at one point, one of the sort of executives of INEB, the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, said to me, he said, "Hey, do you want to write Sulak's biography?" And I knew what it took to write a biography. Like you don't just write the life of somebody. You have to know all the environment around them. You have to know, and Sulak is an intellectual, and we'll talk a little bit about him. To write a book about Sulak, you have to know not only Asian history, but specifically Thai history, and specifically about the monarchy in Thailand. And, being American, I don't know anything about monarchies, right? Like, So in any case, I started doing research on that. And that was what eventuated into the book that just came out less than a year ago called Roar, Sulak Sivaraksa, and the Path of Socially Engaged Buddhism. Yeah. So what have I been doing since I saw you last? I wrote 3 more books, and and last year, a year and a half ago, my wife and I moved out to California. Yeah.
Great. That's quite a lot. So you've been busy. Not
I've
a
been
lot of
busy.
boredom time for you.
Yeah.
So that actually kind of leads to one of the initial questions I had is in this connecting with Sulak. Maybe you could say a little bit more about who he is for those who aren't familiar and understanding that's really what the topic of the book is. So maybe you can dive into that story, maybe starting with your first time meeting Sulak and what
Yeah.
that was like.
The first time that I met Sulak was the I was going to Thailand, and it was in about 2008. And I was going through Thailand. I used to, because I lived in Kathmandu, I was quite familiar. I was going in and out of Thailand a lot. But on this occasion, and I had been working, when I was working with the Tibetans and the International Campaign for Tibet, I was closely associated with the former special envoy of the Dalai Lama, the late Lodi Gary. And he said, "Oh, when you go there, go meet my friend Sulak." And he told me about him. And I had heard of Sulak because I had read his book. He's a prolific author, but he had written a book called Seeds of Peace, which a lot of sort of people who are involved with socially engaged Buddhism, especially in the United States, but in English-speaking world, this book is relatively prominent, I guess, because because when we talk about socially engaged Buddhism, the first person who comes to mind usually is Thich Nhat Hanh. And he was the one who coined that phrase, socially engaged Buddhism, with his experience coming out in the Vietnam War and then being exiled in France. And he talked about this social engagement. And Sulak, interestingly, was Thich Nhat Hanh's first publisher. Thich Nhat Hanh had a manuscript, a typed manuscript called, I think he called it Mindfulness in Daily Life or something. But then Sulak gave the title. It was Sulak's, or it was Thich Nhat Hanh's first book, and he published the English version in Thailand in the 80s. But when we talk about socially engaged Buddhism, oftentimes we think about Thich Nhat Hanh, and then we might think about the Dalai Lama as well, because his role has been one that really can't be separated from politics, because both Thich Nhat Hanh was thrust into politics because of the situation in Vietnam. Dalai Lama was thrust into politics because of being exiled. Then we had another, we have Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar and Burma, who for the most part is completely disappointed most of us. I mean, she was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, but she's very much disappointed us in her reaction to the Rohingyas in Myanmar, in Burma. So there's been these various people oftentimes who, when we talk about socially engaged Buddhism, those are usually the first 3 names that come up. Maybe Mahagosananda, people may have heard of. He did his peace walks around Cambodia. But Sulak has always been there. He's like friends with all of these people and has had a very close relationship with them. And in Thailand, he was, especially in the 80s and 90s, very prominent as a thorn in the side of the government and of the monarchy, which I suppose that we'll talk a little bit about. And because he's so articulate, he's a very complicated individual. That was why I really enjoyed writing about him, is because he doesn't always walk his talk. His talk is beautiful. His spiel, he doesn't really teach. He's not a teacher in the sense of a Dharma teacher like we think of, but he's definitely a teacher. And but he doesn't always walk it, and he knows that. He will even admit to that. And so writing about a complicated individual like him is, and there's a lot of that complication comes out in anecdotes, and as a biographer, that's sort of gold when you have that type of material to work with. I didn't write a hagiography. You know, it wasn't sort of the life and liberation of Sulak Sivaraksa. It was not that. I talk about him getting angry. I talk about his students yelling at him. I talk about him getting in the face of Thich Nhat Hanh, getting in the face of the Dalai Lama for drinking a Coca-Cola. Like, I talk about like very specific, like very real, like person to person relationship, because that is where the life of Sulak really comes out in his personal relationships that he has. And so I draw that out in the book, all of these extraordinary, because, you know, Ted, it's really interesting. Sulak, you know, because he's 88, and he went to England to study law in the 50s. So when he went there, he worked at the Buddhist Society, and he worked with Christmas Humphreys.
Mm.
Now, when we think about Christmas Humphreys, that's like history.
Yeah.
You know, like it's like previous, like how, and he, you know, Sulak was working with Christmas Humphreys when the Dalai Lama went into exile in 1959. Sulak covered the story for the BBC in London.
Mm.
I mean, that's like how far back he goes, you know. But and so he had a fascinating life, and so I had to, you know, understand all of the different eras, the different historical sort of ups and downs of Thailand, the changes with how the monarchy has changed and how he has changed, and that was what I drew out a lot in the book. And so, to get back to your first question, that was, I sort of knew something about him to begin with just through socially engaged Buddhism when I met him in 2008. And we were working together with INEB. And then it was a couple of years later when somebody suggested that. And so yeah, I mean, I said, okay, let's do this, you know? So, but it took a couple of years then of research then, and traveling. I traveled the world with him for like 2 years. It was great fun, actually.
And that's one of the things I wanted to ask about, that you spent several years doing research, getting to him personally, and of course working with him at INEB. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about your own impressions. What are some of the things that stand out for you personally about the human being Sulak?
Mm. Yeah, that's a good question, you know, because in writing the book, I don't know, I guess my personal feelings probably come out in the book, but not like directly, like
Right.
probably I would say right now, you know. Um, you know, he's a very so first of all, he has a big personality, but he's a very like slight individual. He's very short. He's like 5'1". He's kind of a Yoda-like character. He walks with a cane, and he's kind of ornery a little bit. He barks orders, but when he talks, or when he lectures, if you will, he's always lecturing about love and compassion and interconnectedness. And so, what my first, I remember that my first impression of him was that there's a little bit of a contradiction here. There's like I didn't quite get it, you know. And everybody I think a lot of people have that when they meet him, they understand there's something kind of special, that he has he has an impressive intellect, and of all of the aspects of his intellect, perhaps his memory is the most striking, because he remembers everything. He can remember what the weather was like on particular days when he was 14 years old. Like, and I think it comes from, he has this practice. He writes in his diary every day what he did the previous day. He gets up in the morning, he has his green tea, and he writes in his diary who he met, what they talked about, and what he did. There's no sort of poetic flourishes or anything. And he's been doing this since he was 14. At his home, there's like 3 walls of diaries and he doesn't refer to them. And I think his secretary is the only one who can read his handwriting. But the practice of journaling is sort of a lost art. It's sort of a lost art, actually, this journaling and taking the pausing and doing that. It has an actual effect on the capacity of memory, I think. So these, you know, this his memory. And so when he tells you to do something or suggests them, or you have a conversation, he remembers it always. Like, he remembers what he told you like last year. And so when you start a conversation, if you haven't seen him for 3 or 4 months, you come back, he just goes right back in where you were, like where you left off, you know? So, yeah. And I guess like the last thing that I would say about him, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about this. is that what he values most, I think, in life, and you sort of see this, is camaraderie. This aspect of camaraderie is really striking with Sulak. And this, he talks a lot about Kalyana Mitra, or spiritual friendship. I devote a whole chapter to it. And this idea of spiritual friendship that he has, he says he grounds it in the teachings of the Buddha. And he talks about how Ananda asked the Buddha once, is sort of spiritual friendship, how important is it on the path? And the Buddha sort of reprimanded Ananda a bit and said, it's not just a little bit important, it is the path.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and this, we can refer to it, maybe we could talk about it being the Sangha, but in any case, this spiritual friendship, Kalyana Mitra, is really striking, and he is always continuing to develop this all the time. Even now, when he's in his late 80s, every day he has people over to his home, and he's continuing to sort of cultivate these friendships and relationships in the context of the Dharma. And the Dharma for Sulak, and we'll talk about this, is not just studying the scriptures or meditating. It's sort of being in the streets, actually.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I like about the concept of Kalyanvita, is that this humanizes what could otherwise be something that separates us from our humanity. And by that cultivation of that closeness, metta, the loving friendliness, is this connection with others is, I think, not possible if the sasana were just an intellectual pursuit or something that separated us. There would be no need for these truly close, loving bonds. And so to me, that's a very natural fit with not just what it's like to really embody the Dharma and move in this field, but also how this really lends itself toward socially engaged Buddhism, how it really lets us not get separated from what's happening here now, so that we can take action and be engaged with that.
Yeah. And Sulak says he defines sort of Kalyana Mitra, his own definition is, sometimes we might translate it as spiritual friendship or spiritual camaraderie, but he says the way that he defines that is it's those people who tell you what you don't want to hear.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And so there has to be some trust there. There has to be some trust. Like when you tell me that what I don't want to hear, that it's coming from a place of love, or a place of sort of a place that's looking to transform both our relationship and our ability to act in the world. And in the book, I talk about how Sulak is an amazing, he's got a very critical mind. He's an amazing critique. So he performs his duty of giving Kalyana Mitra critique very well. When he receives it, he doesn't always receive it so well, and that's why there's this sort of like I talk about that in I give this one example on the other side, and I mentioned it at the top of the program, that he saw a picture of the Dalai Lama at an event, and the Dalai Lama next to the Dalai Lama was he was drinking a Coca-Cola. And so, and Sulak just could not believe it, because of all of the harm that Coca-Cola does in the world. How not only what you put in your body is terrible, but in India, a Coca-Cola plant, I think had like released some wastewater or something and taken out a village of some sort. So Sulak, the next time he saw him, he said, "I can't believe Your Holiness, that you're drinking Coca-Cola." And the Dalai Lama was like, "Why?" And the Dalai Lama is like, and Sulak was like, "Coca-Cola is part of structural violence." And the Dalai Lama was like, "What is structural violence?" And so then, and I mean, just like what the Dalai Lama always does, is he always asks questions, and so then it opened up an avenue for Sulak and him to have a discussion about this larger picture about it was about, I think we're going to talk about this, sort of what structural violence is, but so like this Kalyana Mitra it's I devote a lot of the book to it, because it's sort of Sulak's guiding principle.
Yeah. Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up because it touches on something that came up in our sit group on this past Monday night, which was the idea of there can be an innocent ignorance, a simple not knowing, and that can open a path to learning. And it doesn't mean that it's on the part of others to educate someone who doesn't understand. And certainly with things like racism and all that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, it's not that, but it's once that door is open, then it is on each of us to walk through. And fortunately for many, I see that once that door is open, you can't close it again. Once
Yeah.
there's that glimpse, once Pandora's box is open, stuff is going to come out, and seeing that. And so what I also want to do is mention to the listeners of this, today, the day we're doing this recording that Matteo has joined me here, is the day that George Floyd is being laid to rest.
Mm.
And the past several weeks have been a time of tremendous civil unrest, and that's not really the story. The story is the continued systemic violence and racism that is in some ways, in many ways, intentionally built into the system. And I want to, Matteo, give you an opportunity to talk for a bit about structural violence and how just so important it is to understand that right now. So the
Yeah.
floor is yours if you want to
Yeah.
wax rhapsodic on it.
Well, I mean, we can have a conversation about this, and about structural violence. I can talk to you also a little bit about how Sulak talks about it from a Buddhist perspective, um, how it is played out, or how it is woven into America. I'm definitely not the person. I'm white. You're white. I think you
Yep.
probably identify as white. So, but I will say this: that my understanding of structural violence that sort of came from Sulak, studying him and then studying the people that he studied, helps me understand, at least intellectually, how it is woven into the system, and how even just being white and the privileges that I already have, just because I, um, um, you know, very highly educated white guy in America, it comes with certain privileges,
Yep.
and and now what is happening in America is we have the opportunity to um, understand that in a more profound way, and how that has actually been oppressing others.
Mhm.
And I was explaining yesterday to somebody who was somebody in my family, actually, who was having a little bit, like, they weren't understanding, I guess, so well. What do you mean? What's wrong with the police? It's just and they just weren't getting what you just said was very spot on. That it is that everything that is going on is important, but the overall the umbrella issue is systemic racism. It is systemic racism, right? So I use this example. I said, okay, I try to use an example. I said, okay, you and I are speaking right now, right? And you're understanding what I'm saying. I'm understanding what you're saying. But as we're speaking, I'm not thinking about the grammar that I'm using. The grammar is the structure that you and I are using to communicate. And I don't for once think I should use a noun. Now I should use a verb. Now I should use an adverb. Now I should pause. Now I should, I don't think about I don't think about that. You and I have this, we know that grammar. We don't even have to think about it. That grammar is built in. So, and so much so that, like, because we don't have to think about it, it is just there. It's a little bit like, it's similar to the way that systemic racism is built into the system. You don't even know it's there.
Yeah, and
It just
especially
is
if you're
how,
benefiting from it, it's seamless.
especially, yeah, exactly that. Yes, I should have said that. Yeah, especially. And so I was trying to say that, use that as an example, that there are things behind what we're doing. There's structures. There's longstanding patterns of behavior behind what we're doing. So, but let's talk a little bit. Yeah. So, Sulak, in his especially in his later work, was always one of the things that Sulak did in his. He first published it in a book called Seeds of Peace, and then it was what he always sort of taught. If people asked him about what is Buddhism, he would say, "Of course, Buddhism is a path where we use mindfulness, we use inquiry, and we try to understand the interconnectedness." That's the sort of the personal path, but the personal path cannot be separated from the societal path. And that societal path, we can relate to it through the five precepts, right? And so Sulak would oftentimes sort of reinterpret not often, he did, that his path and the way that he talked about was a reinterpretation, a sort of 20th century reinterpretation of the precepts. So for example, if the precepts are to abstain from harm, no killing, no stealing, no sexual misconduct, no lying, and no intoxicants, okay? So we can understand that just as a personal, like, okay, I'm not going to kill anybody. Fine, done that. Okay, I'm not stealing anything. Okay, I'm not sleep with anybody's wife. Okay, I'm not lying. That's good. And I'm not really going to have any intoxicants except maybe a little bit of wine. Okay, done. And Sulak would be like, no, 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 no. Let's take a step back here. Regarding the first precept that has to do with abstaining from harm, Sulak would always challenge us to understand, like, how we might not be outright killing anybody, but we have to understand how our actions support wars, or, for example, the breeding of animals for human consumption, or in this day and age, right now, racism. How our actions. So our very first precept as a Buddhist, to abstain from harm or not killing, our our inability to see how we are part of the problem, my inability, I'll just speak personally, my inability to see how I'm part of the problem is actually a contravention of the first Buddhist precept. Perhaps one that I think is the easiest to keep, not to kill, but it's not so easy, right? And the same thing with the second precept, with the stealing. Sulak, talks about the questions, the moral implications of market capitalism. If our involvement with that, are we are we depleting natural resources? Is this actual taking what is not given?
Taking what is not given. Yeah.
Right. The third, with regarding sexual misconduct, Sulak would get into talking about the cultures of male dominance. So yeah, maybe you're not sleeping with your neighbor's wife, but there are other ways that could be an extension of the third precept. The fourth one, abstaining from false speech, or without lying, it brings into question our whole participation with social media. Like, are we lying when I put that photograph on Instagram of me doing whatever? And is that a true representation? And then the fifth precept, about intoxicants, Sulak, because of where he grew, because of growing up in Thailand, he brings in, sort of talks about the farmers, how the farmers grow heroin and coca and coffee and tobacco, and how the economic system presses them down for these things that we use. So maybe I don't think my cup of coffee is anything bad, but if I look down the supply chain, am I actually harming somebody through those intoxicants? So that's sort of his sort of 21st century articulation of the Buddhist precepts, which leads us into talking about structural violence.
Yeah. And what I like about that interpretation, and what has always been of tremendous value that I see in the Dhamma, is not just that surface reading of don't kill, don't steal, that kind of stuff. Well, yes, of course. I think that's pretty straightforward. But if you stop there, you're missing this tremendous value of how it touches your life and the lives of others. And that's always been the real value to me of really doing a deep study and understanding and practice of, okay, what does that mean to me now, here? How does that play out? And not just in a strict literal reading of this one line, but what does this mean to me in my lived experience? And where am I missing things?
Yeah.
To me, this practices on clear seeing And biologically, that's tough. Our brains are wired to filter stuff out after a few moments.
For
There's some
sure.
wonderful optical illusions that show things that, if you stare at one dot, these other dots disappear because our brain is actively filtering.
Yeah.
And so running counter to that is the practice of noticing and seeing what's here and facing it. And that can be really
Mm-hmm.
hard to do.
Yeah, and it's where Kalyana Mitra can come into play. To
Yeah.
have sort of honest conversations. If somebody, especially like white folks talking to white folks right now, is important. Not to sort of put the burden on. We go to our African American friends and sort of say like, tell me what I can do. Like, no, actually, we don't need to be like transferring this emotional baggage onto them.
Mhm.
In our, we need to like do the study. We need to do the research. We need to like do the inquiry. We need to do that simultaneously as we're supporting, you know. So,
Right.
and we might make mistakes, but
We will.
yeah, we will make mistakes.
Yeah.
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 But so this, uh, Sulak, in the last couple of decades, he really started talking about something that he had learned. Actually, there was this Norwegian polymath called his name was Johan Galtung. He's still alive, I think. He's teaching somewhere in the East. And he in 1969 he coined this phrase, structural violence. And we know what we can imagine what structural violence is. It's a sort of system that perpetuates various kinds of you could say racist, or it benefits certain demographics over others. The way that Sulak sort of studied what Johann had to say about it in 1969, and then he sort of transferred it into a Buddhist language. And so to understand how these structures of suffering are perpetuated, he would we return to the Buddhist teachings where the Buddha talked about that we have these sort of seeds of greed, hatred, and delusion within us, right? The three poisons,
Yep.
right? So on our personal practice, yes, we need to work on however we are applying the antidotes or the catharsis of those three poisons in our sort of personal practice, and in whatever tradition that is. I'm not so much a Buddhist chauvinist or anymore. So like you can, in whatever tradition, doesn't even have to be Buddhist, but in whatever methods you need to use to root out the sort of greed, hatred, and delusion, or the seeds of those within us. But simultaneously, we need to work to root those out, greed, hatred, and delusion, in society, in the structures around us. And so Sulak would explain that so he would explain that structure, that greed, hatred, and ignorance manifest in the world. And we can see this like super clearly. It's almost like, yeah, it's so he would explain that greed, that personal greed, manifests in society as the insatiable desire for accumulation, right? An ever expanding possessiveness. In other words, sort of market capitalism, or at least consumerism,
Mhm.
like mass consumerism. This feeling of just wanting more and more, and at the expense of natural resource extraction, that ignores the limits, right? I mean, this is like debate. Like so much of this is we can see how this affects climate change in particular, right? So that our personal greed can manifest when we take it collectively. It manifests as in Sulak's word, at least he sort of attributes it. He paints it in sort of a broad brush here. He says it's capitalism. Now, I would sort of push back on him a little bit, but he would usually stick to his guns. He would say, no, market capitalism is like the way that it's being practiced today is the way that it is practiced. And when I'd ask him about what type of economic system that he would propose, and he would oftentimes sort of quote this. Oh, who was? I'll come back. The name's gonna. Are you gonna? Do you know? I can't remember it right now. But anyways, he would refer to a different kind of economic system. Yeah.
Mhm.
But so okay, we have greed, right? the first, greed. So we have to work simultaneously as we work try to get rid of our own greed. We can work to lessen greed in society. Now, with hatred, or even anger, sometimes I think it's translated as anger, but hatred, Sulak sees the seeds of hatred manifest in the world as militarism, right? And I mean, this is exactly what we're seeing right now in how it manifests in the militarization of our police, not only militarism, but in the militarism as it's being pushed down into our sort of local authorities, right? And finally, ignorance, sort of basic ignorance, vidya. Sulak, he reserves his harshest critique for this, for what he sees as the peddlers of delusion, and which he says are advertisers, and the mainstream media, or just, don't even say mainstream. We don't have to sort of like characterize, just the media in general, not this podcast notwithstanding, but the media, sort of just the normal media and advertisement, which promotes fear. He says the media promotes fear, and then advertisements are always promoting products and ideologies that lead people away from a meaningful life of contentedness towards a sense of a sense of poverty and a sense of separation, that you always want something else. So these three things, right? So he has this sort of greed, hatred, and ignorance. Greed manifests as capitalism, hatred as militarism, and ignorance as a sort of as advertisements. And he questions. So when he talks about this, he says, okay, let's look at how the world is structured right now. And if we looked at America right now, I mean, he just like, and he wasn't particularly, I mean, he does criticize America a lot, but he criticizes everything. He's an intellectual. He's always critiquing. But what I just sort of explained is of his view describes America pretty much right now. Mm-hmm. That it's full of this greed, hatred, and ignorance. But it's not as though America is like some other thing than me. I'm American. I'm part of the system. It's made up of us. And so we have to, as Dharma practitioners, we have to understand our role that we play in there, and how we simultaneously try to rid ourselves of the three poison, but simultaneously we need to dismantle structural violence. So Sulak I haven't talked to him in the last like 3 weeks or so. I'm sure he would be so supportive of what's happening in the United States right now with the protests. You know.
Yeah. And in fact, in keeping along that thread, I want us to shift a little bit because we've kind of covered the topic of the book. We don't want to give everything away. We want people to be encouraged to get.
Oh yeah, let me tell you, there's some great stuff on the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh in it. Yeah. And can I tell you this, Dad? I didn't tell you this earlier when we were chatting, that it took a little bit. When I was writing the book, I was finished. We were going to publish this in Thailand first, and then bring it, and then bring it out with in the English speaking countries after that. And we were ready to go. And 2 weeks before publication, the lawyers stopped the publication, because they said that the book would be in violation of the very strict lèse-majesté law, the defamation of the king. Not because of anything that I said, not that anything that Matteo Pistono said, but because of a few things that I repeat in here, both what Sulak has said and what others have said. And so I actually went to Thailand. We did a book launch at the Siam Society with the former prime prime ministers there. There was like 400 people. It was like this amazing book launch, but there was no book. And I got up there and I said, I'm sorry, we can't, it's not me. And they all knew. They're like, yeah. And you'll read about it in the book. This is very, it's a very draconian sort of law that doesn't allow any criticism at all of the monarchy.
Yeah. And this is one of the things that I really want to just mention is my gratitude that, at least as of this recording, we have a press that can still report. They are specifically being targeted. We're seeing the statistics that that journalists are being targeted and arrested, and specifically pointed out during the protests to be
Yeah.
silenced.
Yeah.
This is wrong, and there you are describing it's written into law
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
can't criticize. And so
I
I just
mean,
want to give a shout out to our journalists who are
yeah.
doing it.
Yeah. Thank you, Ted. And, I just have to say that, I mean, I don't know when this podcast is going to drop, but, what we saw when, the president sort of like cleared out the crowds in Lafayette Square and walked across and tear gassed them and everything that happened there. Um, you know, I, I have not attained any clairvoyant abilities in my meditation practice, but I would say that, that's just the first move.
Yeah,
That's not like, that's not the far extent he's going to go.
yeah, yeah.
So, so we have to, yeah, it's a sad situation in the United States, but, in any case, I don't know if I don't think we want to go too far into
Well, a
that
little
right now.
bit, but so
Yeah,
staying on this topic, because
sure.
the Secular Association that is sprung out of this podcast, we are a socially active group. We just this weekend, our community director Jennifer Hawkins led a special event for us on Sunday night on a can't breathe meditation. 2 hour
Wow.
practice with everyone,
Really?
extremely powerful. And
Ooh.
so you right now you're on the executive council of the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, and I'm wondering, just the past couple of weeks with everything that is up, and again the focus here is not uh, looters and rioting and all that and protests. The story is what has led to this is hundreds of years of systemic oppression and violence and murder. Uh, what's been going on with INEB the past couple of weeks that you're able to share, that you're aware of? I mean, what have things been like for all of you?
Yeah. Well, even if we just go back a couple months, since the coronavirus pandemic has happened, the executive committee got together and we established a fund, to collect some, money to distribute to some of the, communities that have been most severely impacted in India and in, Bangladesh, a little bit in Nepal, and we were able to give some money to Muslim communities in Myanmar, the Rohingya, that is.
Mhm.
And so we've been, and one of the things that we did, is that we started to do weekly Zoom calls, like international weekly Zoom calls. So we'll get a couple hundred people on these calls. They're kind of crazy, but at least now we have it sorted. So that has been sort of going on, and now, what is taking place is what happens in the United States, right? And I, just honestly speaking, I have to sort of I get a sense that some of the people on the executive council of INEB, who are extraordinary practitioners and have for decades themselves tried to explain to white people like me what it's like in their community, especially I'm thinking of a couple of my Dalit friends, in India. They're these, the what some people call untouchable community. So the Dalits, they're like, they're sort of saying, this is exactly what we've been talking about.
Right.
This is so now you see, okay. And so maybe it's a little bit of a window into understanding them deeper. So right now we haven't in the last 2 weeks, we have a call tomorrow, the next call. And I think that we're going to be discussing, because INEB will come out with a statement in support, of the protests. But, and I would say also that the International Network of Engaged Buddhists is, I mean, we have Americans who are involved, and there's other Americans who are on the executive council, but most of our work is in Asia. But I'd say most of our, actions, if you will, are in Asia, and we work with them. We've worked in the past with like the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, in San Francisco. and other communities, or other sort of Buddhist communities, to support their actions. So there isn't anything. I'd just say, so to the short answer is, there isn't anything that we're going to discuss our next actions, but yeah, but there isn't anything that, right now regarding what's happening in the United States, apart from this extending this sort of Kalyana Mitra camaraderie, support.
And I'm wondering if that's a segue for us. Just a final question before I let you go for the evening is what you might say to those who are listening about promoting material change in society. Just your own reflections on that or encouragements for others who might be listening.
Yeah. So I won't give like advice or tell anybody else what to do, but if I have to tell myself what to do, what I have been doing, especially the last couple of years, and I continually to do this, is to let go of thinking I know.
Yeah.
Like continually letting go of this idea that I got it sorted out, I got it figured out. Because oftentimes, even Ted, like you're a teacher now, you're sort of put in this position where you need to be able to articulate the Dharma. You do your study and then you sort of articulate it. And then it sort of comes with that. I don't know with you, and I teach meditation as well. What comes with that, I can't help it. It comes a kind of feeling like, okay, I got this sorted. This is how you do it, And then that feeling of expertise can then, or at least feeling of sort of authority, can then be
effect.
yeah, it can be extended elsewhere, and in fact, and if I would to say this to, fellow white people, especially white men, we're put in a position oftentimes where we're supposed to be in the know and be in charge. But, I haven't thought of this question before. I mean, it's like you're sort of putting me on the spot, but that's okay. I mean, I would just say, just let go. And of course, everybody, for me, when I hear these statements, okay, we're listening to our friends of the people of color, or the African Americans, when we say, okay, I'm listening. Well, listening, if we listen through the same lens that we always have, we're going to hear the same things that we've always thought.
And that's not the stopping point. That's just a starting point.
It's just a starting point. But I would say, even just to listen, that before we listen is to drop that we think we know.
Yeah.
Drop that idea, and then have real deep listening. And I'm not telling anybody, I'll tell that story even just earlier this week. So I'm on the other side of the podcast. I'm a guest today, but I'm hosting a podcast myself, called Hay House Meditations, and we do sort of interviews and guided meditations on it. And I was speaking last week to one of the Hay House African American authors by the name of Spring Washam. Amazing.
Spring's been a guest many times. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So Spring is a friend of mine. I've actually went down to Peru, to her retreat center there, and we're both I would say that we're Kalyana Mitra, right? So she's on the podcast, and she's talking to me about white supremacy, and so we're talking about white supremacy. And then when I start to talk, I say, well, there's white supremacy, and then there's other actions that we take that just come out of being white and just a sort of whiteness. And she said, no, Matteo. She said, you just called it whiteness. That is white supremacy. She said, you're using a euphemism because you feel uncomfortable with the word white supremacy, the phrase white, and you just sort of this white privilege or whiteness. Whiteness, white privilege is all part of white supremacy. So that was like an important moment just recently, I'd say, where I had to let go of thinking that I know anything about what white privilege is. I mean, I've experienced it, but to understand the flip side of it, from where she's coming from, right? From where somebody of color is coming from. So dropping that knowing, that knowing mind, and with having deep listening, that's maybe, if there's anything I could sort of suggest, it might be that. Yeah.
3 little words. I don't know.
Yeah.
Get to know those.
Exactly. And continue the conversation. I might even say to our listeners tonight, I said to Ted, when you asked me if I wanted to come on the podcast, I said, do we really want to have like two white guys talk about the Dharma and racism? And you were like, yeah, let's do this. Like, let's try to have this conversation. This is constructive. We're not going to get rid of our being a white man in this life. Maybe the next life, we don't know, but in this life, this is what we have to deal with. So let's start having honest and sort of deep, meaningful conversations. And so, I think that's, I would suggest that as well. Find your, Kalyana Mitra, that where that trust is, if you need to have that difficult conversation too.
Good point.
And keep on doing the work, because, this is just the change isn't coming, change is here, but it's going to take some time. So
yeah, this is a long slog. This requires sustained intention.
Yeah.
And fortunately, as meditators, Buddhists, that's what we do. We formally practice this sustained attention thing, and that's what's required now, along with a whole bunch of other factors too.
Yeah.
Okay, well, for those who are listening to today's episode, I'm going to have some links on the episode page, as always, to Matteo's website for one, along with links to some of the books we've been speaking about today. Matteo, thank you so much for being here. Good speaking again. Let's not wait 9 years.
Yeah, Ted. We'll do it again within a year or so. Okay.
Great.
Excellent. All right.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.